All right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jean Bell. I direct the Advancing Practice program here at Nonprofit Quarterly, and I'm delighted to be back with Karen Graham from Tech Impact and some other great guests for a second part of a two-part series supporting you around technology this fall. And today we're going to talk about automating the finance office. I imagine many people are somewhere in the process of automation, and that the pandemic has forced us to revisit our timeline and our commitment to automation, I think, in many cases. And so we thought this was a really timely moment to check back in and see, okay, how can we help groups go further, get even more efficient in their finance office? So welcome, everybody. A couple of logistics. As always, this session is being recorded, and we will send everybody who registered a recording with the slides. We use the Q&A feature, not the chat, during these sessions, so you can write in anything you'd like at any time in the Q&A box. We'll be moderating that. We'll be using polls today to engage you and learn a little bit more about what's going on with your process of automation, so stay on the lookout for those. And as always, there's a pop-up evaluation that takes just 3 minutes right when the session ends. That really helps us refine and plan for this program. So thank you. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that this is the second session we've done just in the last month with Tech Impact, and Tech Impact is a nonprofit whose entire mission is helping to use technology to better serve the world, right? And on the next slide, I'm going to show you some of the core program areas of Tech Impact, and of course, we encourage you to go onto their website and learn more. But essentially, you have these three great buckets of services: technology services, hands-on IT support, all of that kind of work, education and training, which Karen leads up, and then workforce development, as I understand it, actually helping people develop their career in technology. So all of these things are things that Tech Impact does. Today, they're going to help us moderate this discussion about finance automation. Next slide, please. So Karen, as I mentioned, is the Director of Education and Outreach for Tech Impact, and she leads that team of researchers, presenters, and writers who create technology information resources. And this is in that bailiwick of creating resources for the field. And a little teaser that I know that she's working on a big project that we're going to help promote in a little while about the return on investment of investing in technology for nonprofits. So we love having this partnership. Welcome, Karen. Next slide, please. And Andrea Mills is from another longtime friend of MPQ FMA, who we have turned to for years for information about finance practice and finance leadership. And Andrea has been with FMA for a number of years and works with nonprofits, individuals, and foundations around their financial management practices. Welcome, Andrea. And finally, Andy Wolber is a tech writer and a contributing writer for Czech Republic, and has taught nonprofit and government technology at Grand Valley State University, in addition to working at a number of important nonprofits. So we welcome you. And I think what I'll do is I'll start us off with a poll to find out who's in the proverbial room and give us a sense of who all is concerned today about automating finance. So give you a second to tell us which role is closest, best describes what you're coming to the session with. Are you a head of finance, a finance staff, an ED, a consultant or contractor, or another role in your organization? Okay, we'll end the polling and share results. Okay, so we have a really good mix of folks, which was similar to our last partnered session. A lot of people in finance, about 2/3 are in finance, either as a director or a staff member, and then a number of leaders and contractors as well. So welcome to you all, and I'm going to turn it over to Karen to lay out the session and get us started.
All right, thanks for that great introduction, Jean, and welcome everybody. Over the next 20 minutes or so, Andy is going to take you through some findings from research that we did at Tech Impact about what kinds of financial operations can be virtualized, and maybe some that are a little bit more challenging to do, and then also what kinds of tools are available and approaches to do that. So we'll start out with that, and then after that we will have a conversation together with me and Andy and Andrea, and I think Jean might chime in here and there as well, to unpack this a little bit, and also to talk about questions that you bring to us. So I'll encourage you throughout the presentation that Andy's doing to start collecting questions for us in the Q&A, and then we'll try to address as many as possible once we get to that conversation point. So Andy, over to you.
All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining. Just the whole goal of all of this is so that you as a nonprofit leader have more time to think about the important impacts that finance can have on your operations and your organization so you can fulfill your mission better. If you're caught up in the transactional details of processing payroll, of processing donations, you can't have the time you need to really think about how do we need to shift to deal with the changing world and better serve the people and fulfill our mission. So that's the overall goal of this. We'll be mentioning some tools, but most of this, I want you to really sort of get some sense of, here's how, at least one approach to thinking about where you can focus and pick first to go after some priorities in your operations. So really, focus on the things that provide the most pain. And so that's, in an organization, that's going to really vary. I like to think of it in sort of a couple ways. The first is thinking in terms of where does an organization just very simply get its revenue and where are the expenses. And so this overall frame will really vary. Revenue very simply earned and contributed. And I know those, I know contributed income is earned. I get it. I've been there, I've been a development director, but as defined in finances. So on the earned side, different organizations, focus on real need for billing, particularly in social services and healthcare focus areas. So billing systems tend to be very important. Ticketing systems tend to be very critical in the area of performing arts, for example, cultural organizations and such. Anything that provides some sort of gate or that sort of revenue. And then point of sale, which has increasingly become, something that people want to also have, these days, real focus on making those a truly digital process so that people aren't even having to tap screens and stuff, and they can just tap to pay with their phone, and there's no additional touching of the traditional signing of paper slips and handing things back. So often in the earned area, on the contributed side, these areas can also provide a lot of pain in organizations. If you don't have an effective constituent relationship management system to handle all of your individual or corporate donors or foundation donors, sometimes automating that so that transactions from those areas can smoothly then be pulled into your accounting system can have a huge win for an organization and take a lot of transactional processing out of that. Either having things automatically flow in with review, flow in with consolidation, or flow in with all details. There's a huge variety of ways you can configure those, but those can be essential as well. On the expense side, the picture is a lot simpler. In the nonprofit sector, in my experience, in everything I've seen, your expenses, our expenses tend to be people. And sure, every organization has other expenses, and there's certainly an exception, but a significant piece of organizations' expenses are people. So the big win there is often to automate payroll in some sort of way, or things associated with payroll, which again may be things like time tracking systems, because those trigger either billing and or payments in varying ways to staff or employees. And then other stuff is always present in the form of just all the other bills that your organization has to handle. Things related to if you own a facility or manage a facility, all the things related to office and communications, all the infrastructure you need to communicate to and to serve your clients. So the other category in expenses is the thing that I see tends to get extremely messy and to be very distinct for organizations, but it also tends to have smaller transactions and not nearly be the same scale financially. as far as the total scope of the expenses allocated to people. The second frame of this, so that's one way to look at it, is sort of where are the revenue and expense pain points, is from a workflow standpoint. And FMA provided some insight into sort of looking at a way to think about how you handle processes, and workflow is an essential way to analyze your system. So just the thought of, you know, a pre-paperless world where things come in the mail, they're handed to someone physically, someone opens that, someone makes a copy, hands that off to someone else. Things are routed around the office in manual folders and files. I know organizations that still work this way. And then as things are approved, then paper checks are processed, signatures are added. That then triggers someone to put that payment back in an envelope and to hand it out again to the postal service. And that whole process can be quite slow, can provide a lot of places where things can get stuck or slowed down if people are out or unable to process things in that workflow. It also completely makes it difficult to get any visibility into where something is. So just getting a handle on, in a pre-paperless world, just knowing exactly where things are can be quite difficult. I'm sure some of you have lived through this and are used to asking the finance office for something, or are in the finance office trying to provide status of things, and you end up hunting things down. Many more conversations than necessary. In the digital world, that can go into digital systems that then get approved either in triggers with notifications, either with an electronic system that triggers an alert on an app or an email. With digital signatures, you can handle a lot of this and pass things on for approval, and then automating on the payment side as well, where things just automatically go out either with a service or ideally in many cases with an electronic transaction. So there's no paper generated throughout that process. That's the world that we see the world is moving to for the most part. And this is the world that gives you greater visibility faster as to where your organization is financially. So there are a lot of barriers to this, and I'll want to know a little bit sort of what, if, I assume not all of you are at the fully automated status at this point. So let's go ahead and see what's holding you back from automating.
Wow, it's distributed pretty well across them, isn't it? But control concerns are a biggie, and staff resistance, readiness, yeah. But they're all significant to some extent, sounds like.
Great. Yeah, and control can certainly be a concern. We'll talk a little bit about some of that. So I like to think of this, and this is a little glib, and I know that, but I like to put these things, the solutions, and the way I frame this and think about it, at least if it's helpful to you, great. If not, I'm sorry. But it's thinking of this as the core, a store, and more. And we're going to talk about each of those things. The core being your core accounting system. I know Karen referenced some work and research we had done, and this is work we had done, a couple of years ago, a year or two ago, I think, yeah, 2018. But when I went and dug through it again, it's still extremely relevant. So I strongly encourage you all to take a look at this if you're wanting to dig into some of these solutions in some more detail. The key, this report guides you through a lot of the steps, really making sure that the team involves not just you picking a system, but also involving board members or people in your organization who are handling different aspects of this work, looking at workflows, and then how to vet vendors so that you're not spending tons and tons of time looking at things that have something that make it absolutely not work. So some of the things we'll talk through today will address and give you some pointers on where to start. And so I just want to point that guide. I do want to note, after this, you'll have access to these slides. You'll be able to access these. And the links that you see in here, everything that's underlined in blue, so here, like at the lower left of this slide, they're live, they work. You can click on them and they'll open in another browser tab, and you'll be able to explore and look at all the resources. So on some of these slides that we're going to have lots of names, don't worry about writing those down or taking a screenshot. You can actually get to the core slide with live links, which is more helpful than a screenshot. So the core system in the nonprofit sector, by far, easily at this point, QuickBooks is the dominant. If you don't know what sort of core system an organization will use, it's probably QuickBooks. Once they get bigger and your budget sizes and complexity goes up, it tends to shift away from that at some point, because organizations have the need to track and report across multiple aspects of program and operations. But changing out your core accounting system is a way to do this. In recent years, the shift in question has always been, what do we do? We have been using QuickBooks on an installed system, and is it time to move? I know that, and maybe Andrea can address this later in detail. But I know in my conversations with her, she mentioned her team had recently felt that some of the QuickBooks Online add-ons and some of the changes that QuickBooks improvements QuickBooks has made QuickBooks now a very viable system to be able to do the kinds of accounting, QuickBooks Online, as opposed to QuickBooks Installed. So I know some organizations have stalled out on making that shift from an online system to a cloud system. The other thing in many of these systems is a few are sort of cloud native and have been that way from the beginning. Things like Intact or NetSuite. NetSuite was one of the very earliest ones that was cloud-based from the beginning. Others offer a blend and have been making that transition from an installed system to a cloud-based system. So, larger systems like Blackbaud, for example. So shifting that core is probably one of the steps. It's also one of the steps you likely want to do at a clean sort of financial reporting point. So either at a clean, end of month, half year sort of mark, or full year, end of accounting year, to switch over to a new system. That whole process involves some planning, some transition time, and many complicated choices in some cases about how much detail you pull over from historic things, or if you just sort of reference stuff in the old system. So shifting that can help by moving to an online cloud-based system. You move things so that more people can access it. Since the concern is a lack, one of the concerns was control, and I hear that. I know that people feel that if their system is, core system is on site, they can see the server where it's installed or the desktop system where it's installed. The cloud system, you can't. So some things inherently are absolutely outside your control. You need internet access in order to access your data. However, the way I think about some of this is that there's a whole set of maintenance and security functions and also access functions that a cloud system can provide that an on-site system does not necessarily. With a cloud system and proper configuration, you're focusing on configuration, typically on choosing and setting up preferences, versus on-site, you have also all the complexities of whatever server that or device that thing is sitting on, and maintaining that. So in general, I would say for most organizations, if you're at the point where you're concerned about whether the cloud is secure, it is. I would say that the cloud is secure and as safe as the number of security teams that the company can put against it. So I would venture that a company like QuickBooks or Sage Intacct or any of those others on that list have more people dedicated to full-time IT security than your nonprofit organization. So I like to think of it in terms of you're getting actually access to that expertise that you don't have in your organization and probably should never have in the vast majority of nonprofits. So shifting your core, that can move a lot of things digital. Most organizations that have chosen to go, have chosen their core and don't want to either change that or have that already set or fixed. The next piece is when you're looking for solutions and alternatives is to look at the store. And all the major vendors have stores. So QuickBooks, if you're working with QuickBooks, they have a directory just like the Apple or Google stores have apps. QuickBooks, Sage, Xero, many of the larger accounting vendors have worked to build up libraries of their companies that and partners that fit well with their products. The value here is that while QuickBooks handles things like bill pay, for example, that it is not optimized for all the pieces along the bill pay or expense management process. So when you choose a focused solution, you can get some workflow benefits sometimes. And if you choose a focused solution that integrates well with your chosen accounting system, you also then get the benefit of not having to rekey data, having some assurances that yes, the vendors' systems will talk to each other. And so I always encourage folks to start at the store. Sage, for example, I just want to sort of take a look here if I can, hopefully I can do this reasonably well. So Sage, for example, has some listings and you can see, you can do a search if you want to search, you can search by categories. So the huge range of things that, for example, time and expense is a typical pain point for many organizations. So I would start here. If I were using Sage Intacct, I would need a time tracking solution and an expense management solution. I would start here and take a look at the systems. The one thing that they do provide, for example, if you drill into the detail, they'll give you the usual overview and then information about the organization and some information. They also will typically give you some general guidelines about cost. And note that the cost price is something that is, I know some of you indicated, was sometimes a barrier. So this can be a fairly fast way to browse through a set of systems that might work for your organization. Similarly, Sage also is helpful on the left-hand side here to explore by not-for-profit solutions, things that they see used frequently in that sector. This list, typically I don't find organizations pursue this list a whole lot because usually when you're wanting something, you're wanting a particular sort of functional sort of solution, but that is there. The one other piece, and jump back to QuickBooks here, QuickBooks additionally has, with their store, they provide a couple other things that can help you a little. So I'm just going to use the time tracking in this case. QuickBooks Store does the added benefit of providing and giving you visibility into both store ratings and they're with a star system, and then also with the number of sort of ratings and that they've received. I will tell you, and I'm going to scroll down quickly, so sorry about this, but notice something about the vast majority of systems are rated pretty well, but then when you get some lower. But when you look at then the numbers are quite small. And if you go down to the bottom of their page for time tracking solutions, there are some that don't even have ratings in the system. That doesn't mean those aren't good solutions for your organization. But if you're wanting to not spend time going through all of those, I would tend to take a look at systems that have wide usage, so a lot of customer base, and then reasonably good ratings. In general, on these sorts of rating systems, my take is anything 4 and above is good. There's always a set of folks who can't figure out how to do a thing, or will rate something very, very low just because it didn't meet something or they misunderstood a requirement. Again, you go into some of the details here, you can get a glance at some of the specifics, and then link out to contact the developer to look at specific more minute details. In some other cases, it's not so much a store as a partner product. So I know, for example, I worked with a foundation that all of their fundraising system was a Blackbaud system. And so when they were looking for an accounting system and considering switching something, in their case, it made it a very good incentive to switch to Financial Edge from NXT, from Blackbaud, because it was designed to work, and it at least comes from the same company. The degree of integration, again, in all of these things, and smoothness with how things work will vary, but often your CRM system or customer relationship management system might also dictate some other choices you make. So the thing is, even if something's listed in the store, the strength of that integration may vary. So, which may affect how you need to drill back into detail. So it's the conventional thing of, if a summary, so using a donor management system, which I'm sure many of you use, if you track all your donor details for individual members in a donor database, and then that integrates and does connect over and kicks in, the level of detail that kicks into your financial system may vary. And the ease that you can maybe undo a transaction is the other thing to explore, to test the actual strength of an integration. So for example, if you need to refund a member or a portion of a member contribution, like a public media station might, for example, how complex is that process? So not when you're asking and looking at strength of integration, I encourage you to look at the undo process, because often that can be a harder process and give you a better indicator of how well that system truly integrates. Because almost every system, if they work and connect, will say, yeah, we will pull that in, and ask that next step, how to undo it. On trust and security, again, speaking to those control issues, look for public dashboards, vendors that provide public status. That's, so it's the thing of, in the last several weeks, both Google and Microsoft have had enterprise outages for a few hours. Both of those organizations, however, are professional about it and do provide, dashboards that will let you check to see that, okay, it's a problem on their end, not ours. So that's a key indicator. Smaller, newer providers may not have that. And if a vendor you're considering doesn't provide that, I would tend to shy away from them. The other thing to look for, and this will vary, is various certifications. For organizations, particularly that are doing work in different markets, so in the EU, or doing NGOs that do work in countries overseas, there are a variety of certifications you can look for, credentialing that will vary based on the type of the firm. But there are security configuration certifications that are essentially audits that ensure that an organization and cloud vendor has gone through an ongoing audit. So for example, in some cases, some of the larger consultancies like an E&Y, Ernst & Young in the old days, will audit an organization and provide some verification that yes, they are complying with the procedures and processes to ensure security and that changes happen in a secure way. The other piece is to look for security. We are dealing with money. Anything that you can connect and link into your single sign-in so that you don't give an additional login to staff is really good. So if people can sign in with Google or Microsoft credentials and go on, that's fantastic. Add on anything that also requires multi-factor authentication. So if people can authenticate through, but they've already done that multi-factor authentication with their Google Workspace or Microsoft 365 sign-in, and then have access to things, that's excellent. Look for things that offer some form of two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication. And then again, external audits that ensure that they're complying and doing what they say. The third piece of this is third-party apps. And these are things that then, so core, your accounting system, store, stuff that is designed and you can find to work with your accounting system, and third-party apps that may or may not tie into your system directly. Things such as payroll, and the links on this page all go directly to, if there is a section, a nonprofit reference. But the important piece on this is to realize that you may be able to get nonprofit discounted pricing. So these pages link to that nonprofit or discounted pricing if it's available. Sometimes you have to ask for it directly from the company. Other times it's available from places like TechSoup, which many of you, I hope, are familiar with, which is free for nonprofits, but then typically you pay a small administrative fee. And the other place to look is places like, in this case, for paychecks, Michigan Nonprofit Association has partnered with them so that if you're a nonprofit in the Michigan Nonprofit Association member, you can get some discounted services and have direct contact into the company. So look at your trade associations, your status nonprofit associations, and explore discounts. These are the other areas. It's things like handling bills, expenses, payment processing like Square or Stripe, and some of these other sort of payroll things. I'd love to get some sense of sort of what topically, sort of functionally, you're most interested in exploring. And these are things that we'll be able to sort of maybe speak to a little bit later. So bill pay followed by, as I see it,
payroll.
Grants management and budgeting.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent.
It's interesting to me that grants management showed up really high on that list, and I'm wondering how that's connecting in people's mind to being a virtual office. And like, how is grants management feeling different now that you're not in an office together, like I assume many of you were before? So maybe that's something to refer to the questions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that would be great. I would wonder if that's related to some project communication pieces and tracking.
Yeah, I'd love to comment on that when we get to the panel. It'd be great.
Okay.
Excellent. So I know payroll wasn't a huge thing, so I won't spend a ton of time on it, but I do encourage you, again, to consider things like automating payroll and using a service for that integrates with your system. ADP has set up discounts at TechSoup, so this is an example of sort of the administrative fee. If you have a larger organization, that's a higher rate. And there's a different sort of particular product you can select at the TechSoup site. Beyond that, and we can certainly explore tons of other things. The other thing to consider is there are lots of startups. And I've included a list here, and I'll just sort of give you a sample of this. You can explore this. And this was from January. I found this useful, and this is a decent sort of list with a ton of links. This is one of the best lists I've seen. There's a slew of examples of organizations and startups in various areas, and this just goes on. There's 100 plus of these that are worth a look. The caution and consideration I would have on all of this sort of financial area is if you're choosing something from the store that connects to your, that hooks up to your accounting system, that's where I would look first for things like bill payment systems. because it works well with your stuff. You will find interesting and innovative things if you have a particular niche solution coming out a lot. So this list has a lot. A sort of startup site, Product Hunt, that I follow, also publishes many sort of new startups. They're not finance focused. They do all sorts of financial software startup things. The downside is they're startups. And so what tends to happen is even those that are good and innovative, after a year or two, they'll shift in some significant way if they're savvy and nimble, or they'll get acquired and then integrated in. So just be aware if you're choosing something that is a newer solution that is from a smaller company, smaller developer, or a startup, that the stability and ongoing availability of that is, I would consider, a significant risk factor. So if you're a small nonprofit with 2 or 3 people and it's not a critical part of your operations and it really solves some pain points, fantastic, go for it. But just be aware if you're a larger organization trying to deploy a system that is a newer solution that hasn't done all the full integrations yet with your store and your core accounting system, that there may be some risk that you may have to make another round of change management in the future. So just that's my only caution on that. The things to look for on all of these systems are the export-import piece. How do you get your data out of a system? In the same way I referenced, how do you undo a transaction? How you get your data out of the system. So if you're paying bills in a particular system, how often and how consistently do you get your data out if you need it? The other thing to look for, and it's a little bit geeky, is does the vendor offer an open API, application programming interface? It's a term that has been around for a while, but essentially, are they building a platform that you can build connections between systems? Or are they building something that's really sort of closed and locked that other software programmers and developers cannot connect to? So look for an open API. Things that are more robust and better designed will have an API that allow third-party systems to connect to them in secure ways. The last thing is to think about this as an app or a service. And it used to be you had people to do things, or in here you had to make a big expense on buying a server and upgrading and buying all the software you needed. And now it's transitioning to the right side here of operational expenses, subscription services. So if you're concerned about sort of that shift, the way I think about it is sort of this, and that's an old photo of me back when I had hair on the left, sitting in an office, processing paper and actually handling things, that you're paying a person a lot of time to do things. Capital expense, this is an actual photo of a server that is running QuickBooks for one of my clients. They had to spend significant dollars, several $1,000s every X5 to 7 years on upgrading and maintaining and on doing all of that, or shifting out to the operational expense and just saying, look, we're going to go to finance or accounting as a service and move to this with some blend of either outsourcing key operational pieces and key functions and to a sort of a firm that can provide a virtual CIO or virtual CFO rather, or having a piece of that where you maintain some financial expertise on staff and having specific functions and services and subscription services, things like Expensify and your accounting service and all that, where it's a monthly cost that you can ratchet up or down based on your organization size or need without having to worry about sunk costs in a server. So with that, that's sort of a quick frame, or I hope a relatively somewhat useful frame of this. And I will now, I'm sure I've said several things that need to be corrected, amended, or expanded on. I'll turn it over to Jean or Karen to moderate the panel.
Sure. Yeah, I'll kick us off with that. I know we have at least 2 open questions from audience members so far, and then there were also a couple of additional things that I jotted down as you were talking. But I'll start us out with this one just to get the conversation started. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what happens in the implementation process. We've talked a lot about like what kinds of tools to look at and how to choose these tools, right? But not quite so much about the implementation. So maybe I'll direct that to you to start, Andrea, since I know you have a lot of experience helping organizations and guiding them through that process.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of implementation, we will look to see like when is the organization's year end. Because we want to actually start the conversation around implementing new software before your year end is upon us. And there are situations where we roll in, where we're starting after the year end, but we try to minimize them to the greatest extent. And so we want to kind of like build I call it the architectural plan. What's the chart of accounts going to look like? What are all the segments going to look like? What are the final reports we need to look at? And really go through an in-depth thought process about how we want the system designed before we actually start to build the system. So that's time and commitment, and it's from all team members too. Because if you think about it, finance is a support function within an organization, and they're supporting fundraising and program. And so we want to make sure that all team members have had a say in, what would the final product look like. And of course, the goal is when we start our new year, July 1st or January 1st, and we flick on the light switch in a new system. So, in terms of, but as you can imagine, there's training time. People have to use the system. When I look at implementations, I kind of see it. You go like this, and then you've got to play with it for a little while. And then you go back and you learn some more. And so it's a process that's not, something that you're going to say, oh, we're going to do this in 4 weeks and we're going to be done with it. It's really the organization has to have a commitment to a time frame in terms of maximizing the system and making it work to a level it should.
Mm-hmm. And that's been my experience with any kind of software implementation, really, is that often there's actually kind of a dip in productivity not long after it's introduced. And that can be discouraging, but really it's just because people are taking extra time to learn the new system. And so, things just take longer. But if you plan that into the process, if you plan to provide additional training support over an extended period of time and additional sort of tweaks to the system as you learn more about how it works for you, then that can really be helpful. I can't just ask you like, Andrea, how long does this take? Because we're talking about so many different kinds of apps and things like that. But maybe can you give an example of like one kind of app for a virtual finance office that would be pretty easy and quick to implement, and then maybe one on the opposite side of the spectrum that would be like you're talking about a pretty big deal?
I mean, it would be great to have my team here because they're the rock stars who have all the answers. But from them, Bill.com, that was an app we were pushing a lot. It was, it's pretty easy to get up and running. I mean, there's some cleanup maybe in certain cases. You want to make sure you're working with a good vendor list in that situation. But they can get Bill.com up and operating pretty quickly. And during COVID, that was the cry. Oh my goodness! Now I can't make it to the office. I can't cut checks. How am I going to pay my vendors? And we had spent a lot of time talking to organizations about automated bill pay and getting those systems up and running. Now, on the other extreme, when one of the grants management side of the equation. So, what we're saying around FMA world is we're like, we've got the expenses down. We know how to allocate. We've got it all down. Now, let's look at the revenue side of the equation. And if you think about it, in the nonprofit world, your revenues are your most complicated side. You're dealing with other people's money, donor funds. You have complicated contracts. You may have foundation and corporate reporting requirements. So if we look at it, revenue is really the complex side of the equation. So we've been really looking at how can we make that process easier, and where it's less time commitment to be able to go and vouch on a government contract, or to be able to produce that funder report at the end of a quarter. And we've really been, I would say, over the past couple of years, our goal is to really get grants management down to a science with the tools that are out there. And so that is connecting time entry to, what's the end result and what are we going to bill for what we're doing, and tracking data.
Mm-hmm. And that was one of the questions that I had flagged to come back to about grants management. Like, how does that relate? How is that different in this virtual environment where people are working remotely from each other? Do you want to say anything more about that?
I would say it's always been there. Mm-hmm. And so the goal is to get off of the Excel spreadsheet. And not every system allows us to do that. And so one of the questions we ask an organization is, how much are you doing outside of the system? And someone will give us this Excel thing that, if it ever crashed, it would be the end of the day, right? And so we try to say, how can we get this all coming out of the system? I know this sounds very simplistic, where we push a button, and there are add-ons to softwares. I was sitting in an Intact demo 2 years ago on a software selection, and they were showing an add-on that you could put where it would automatically reclassify, it would collect your expenses in a bucket, and then at the end of the month, it would automatically set up the entry for what you would be billing for that bucket. And it was, and it was an automatic, and you have to go in and review it, but it was a pretty neat add-on. We were all oohing and ahhing for it, so.
Yeah, that's great. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk, actually revisit like selecting software. And so there's a question from a mysterious anonymous attendee that says, we are a new C3 trying to set up the infrastructure. We use Salesforce for donor management. Where do we start in selecting all the other software? And I actually want to ask another question kind of to piggyback on that too. So where do you start when you're selecting all these different things? And then also, how do you think about the ROI for them, and how do you know it's worth it?
Yep. So what we start with is actually, I'm the finance person, so of course accounting is really important to me, but we start with the most important system for the organization, and that might be the CRM. So I might have a fundraising organization that re-grants. Well, their CRM is extremely important. So we're going to start there and then find out what systems the CRM will talk to without having to duplicate it, entry. And so when we talk about, is it we have to import export? Can we create a bridge that automatically happens? And so those are all the conversations. So with any embarking on new software, we look for what's the most critical package to have in place. And then we look around it. So in terms of that young C3 starting out, I would go back to the Salesforce rep and start to have conversations with them around, what other systems have you been working with? We have attached Salesforce to other systems. Sometimes it's been easier than others. And then in some cases, there's a variety of different questions that need to be answered. But I know Salesforce has been making a big push in the not-for-profit world, and I would go back there and start to have a conversation with them.
Yeah, and I know Salesforce has its own app store or app marketplace that is quite extensive. Andy, is that one that you looked at? I know you didn't use that as an example, but is that one that you looked at in your research too?
Not recently, but I have previously, as I think you probably know, worked a lot with that. So I'm fairly familiar with it. The Salesforce App Store has a lot of stuff. Its connections to financial systems really vary. So it's not as seamless a plug and play as one might hope. So I would, if I were looking for a Salesforce solution, I would not only go talk to whoever you'd worked with to deploy Salesforce, I would also, if you've settled on or narrowing down within the Salesforce App Store, I would see if you can get the vendor you're considering to give you some client names to go talk to some nonprofits that are using that integration or connector, because that information can be really useful in choosing a system to really understand the nitty-gritty details of how this affects daily life. So
yeah. Andrea, I love how when you first started talking about that, you said like start with the thing that's most important, and I agree with that, and yet I'm going to offer it's kind of a contrary approach to that, which is that I think sometimes it's helpful, and you can disagree with this. Sometimes it's helpful to start with something that is not really that big of a deal, but it's delightful and it's easy. And, it just solves a problem for people and immediately makes their lives easier. And I'm wondering if there's anything that comes to mind when I talk about that. Like, is there some tool that you are aware of that is just like a quick, easy solution to a problem that would be worth people taking a look at?
Interesting question. I guess for me, well, of course, I want the greatest and best for, when we're working with an organization. And so when I said start with the critical, and I'll go back to my granting organization. They fundraise, so they're on Blackbaud for their CRM, and they're on QuickBooks. And they can be on QuickBooks because all they're doing is bringing in donor dollars and then re-granting back out. They're pretty simple accounting. But would I want them to go to a system where you could automatically choose from a group of dashboards and get more bells and whistles? And yes, I would, because it offers more, or a system that's going to allow you to make a one-sided journal entry. And I know in accounting world that's like, ooh, we don't do that, but where to allow you to track programmatic metrics like number of meals served or number of cases met with, and then it'll tie it into cost per unit and so there are, you could go to the next level and go with all the bells and whistles, but also with any software there has to be an internal dedication to the maximization of that software. And it comes in a course of time. It's not, as soon as you flip the light switch.
Yeah. Andy, anything to add there? Was there something that came to mind for you?
I mean, the fun feature of being able to take a photo of, of an expense, and get it classified and have that go into the system. That's a neat feature. I think by now most people have used that at some point. I think the other thing I would look at is, I wish I'd had this when I was running a historical organization. We had a little gift shop thing, all the things that allow the smartphone payments, that sort of stuff. I think that's very visible. It makes the purchasing experience very convenient for a guest. And I think that there's no reason nonprofits have to stay stuck in the cash check or let me swipe hand me your credit card world. These days, so I still see too much of that and organizations that haven't gone to that touchless payment system. So I think for me, that would be something I would try to nudge more organizations to.
Yeah. And when people were mentioning security issues, I'm sorry, Karen, I can't cut you off. When we are trying to encourage our nonprofits to get off of check stock. And so if you think about, if you go to a bill pay solution, and bill.com will be my example again, when you can cut a check, you can still cut a check, but it's on bill.com's bank account and routing number. And so if you're floating your check stock out there, you're leaving yourself open for people to recreate your checks again. And so that's where there's a big encouragement. And I'm seeing the auditors start to make the recommendation too, which is a good thing, because we all know when it gets into the management letter, for some reason, people start to take a little bit more note to the conversation.
Yeah. I was going to kind of comment a little bit more on something there, but while I'm doing that, I want to ask you, Andrea and Andy, to look at the questions we've had so far You can see all those, and maybe just pick your favorite question that you want to take next. I'll let you do that. But while you're looking at that, I just wanted to comment, when I said like sometimes you want to pick the most important thing strategically, right? And then other times you want to pick something that just kind of delights people. I think underneath that is this belief that I have that if you want to win people over to technology, that you have to give them pleasant experiences with it, right? And that is actually a strategic move to let people have some technology that solves a problem for them that actually like makes their life better as an employee. And then that can help the organization ultimately become more tech savvy and give them an advantage that way. And similarly, Gina and I talked a little bit before, or maybe we were all involved in that conversation about how the process of implementing and rolling out these tools, or even selecting these tools, can actually have some benefits for helping people become not just more tech savvy, but also more financially savvy throughout the organization. So do you want to talk a little more about that? Like, how does that operate?
Yep, I can give you a real life example. We implemented a system a couple of years ago where the organization was growing. It was going from like 6 million to 12. They were taking over a charter school. And the finance director said, there's no way that we can operate the way that we are. We need a new system. One of the most important things that was requested in the new system is that all of the program directors had view-only access to their budget by actual reports 24/7. So I was a program director. I could just go in. I could look at where I was. I could look at each one of my grants. And as you're decentralizing responsibility. You're getting it out of the finance team off to program. And they did that. And it was it brought up the financial savviness of the program people, because not only were they playing more of a role in coding, what government contracts to spend down first, looking at their data, very timely, getting invoices over quickly because they wanted it in the system, and they'd call and say, I just sent the invoice over, where is it? And the accounting would be like, we just got it. And so it really, it changed the culture within the organization for them to be able to handle that growth.
That's a great example. Thank you. Andy, do you have a favorite question that you want to pick?
I'm going to try to tackle a couple because they're related. So there are a couple of questions about we moved to Microsoft and we're wanting to be paperless, Microsoft 365, and we want to be paperless. Another person said we didn't touch on document management. So I just want to sort of nudge people a couple things. The two systems to think about. One is take a look at the systems you might have for scanning. Any sort of your copier contract, if you have one, typically if you're, those also typically can be upgraded, or nowadays are come by default with built-in scanners that can scan both to local files. Typically you can also set local files. You can generally, if you do this, and I've done this before with a couple different vendors, you can set things to scan to a particular file or folder on a local system that then syncs up to the cloud. So that's one way to get some stuff at least automated in. The other tool, I just want to encourage folks to keep in mind that many of your folks may have a little phone. The vast majority of your team probably have a smartphone. The camera on your phone is probably the best camera because you're carrying it with you. These days, even I've tested the cheap $100 low-end budget old version of Android phone will take very good photos, particularly of documents. The Microsoft and 365 app has some things. The other thing related to this is all the stuff with workflow around it. I know Microsoft has Flow. Take a look at the Microsoft Flow product. They're building sort of an approvals thing. And many of the signature vendors, things like DocuSign or HelloSign, which I know is now owned by Dropbox, a lot of the cloud vendors are moving into that sort of workflow approval signature space as well. So I'd explore those.
Okay. Great. Andrea, do you have a favorite question that you want to pick here?
I guess, as I'm reading through, I'm seeing the challenges with managing government dollars. And I guess I just wanted to make a comment in terms of with a lot of the organizations we work with, that's now the time when you should be graduating from QuickBooks. So, QuickBooks gets us in, and we have a system to help us with accounting, but once we start to get with more complicated funding sources, and now might be the time to start having a conversation around looking at something that's going to make life easier and get rid of those Excel spreadsheets.
Mm-hmm. Great. I'm looking now to the question that seems to have the most thumbs up. So maybe a lot of people share this question, which is about approval of payments. So I'll read this. This question is from Susan. She writes, our biggest issue is approval of payments. In the past, you had an invoice or check. Now everything is virtual. How can we provide more documentation of tasks to ensure there is an approval trail? And that also kind of gets to another just more general question I have about, like, how do you handle controls and separation of duties with all of these apps? But maybe let's start with payments.
So I'll go, Andy, unless you want to. Within, and I'll use Bill.com as the example again, you can set up the approval process. So the invoice comes into the portal, it gets coded and put in. Then it gets sent to someone to review it and say, yep, this is all good. Once I do that, it goes over to the next person. They may be the authorizer. They're allowed to say we're going to pay it. Even if you then need two people signing, it might be anything over $5,000 or $10,000. Someone else is supposed to sign it. No more of this having the messenger checks over to the board member, down the block. Now that person could be anywhere in the world and they're going to get the second approval. And we'll literally sit down and map out the steps, the flow chart, the steps in the game. And then there are walls between where somebody who enters something can't be the ultimate payer. There are walls that are set up in the system so that you can have it function like that. All of your documents are all there electronically. You can see the process. So if I have a question about a vendor invoice, there's communication that's right there. My check is electronically pasted back to the invoice. I, as a vendor, get in the morning when I wake up, I'll see the list of all the clients who are paying, because we make sure we get our clients up on an electronic bill pay. I'll say, so-and-so client has authorized Bill.com to issue you a payment. You'll be receiving your funds in 3 to 5 business days, or there's an electronic transfer coming. So there's ways in the technology to set that all up.
Mm-hmm. When I first started as an executive director 5 or 6 years ago, I honestly was kind of terrified about all of this. I was based in Minnesota. The coworkers that I had were based in other parts of the country. We had no physical office. And so we were doing all of our accounting kind of for the first time, like in this dispersed way. And I was just so worried about making a mistake and getting in trouble. But it sounds like, especially if you work with a professional to advise you on this, right, that you can set up a perfectly legitimate process that does the separation of duties. And I think that's a good example. We did have another question from Marie about workflow for approvals using Bill.com, and I think you just addressed that, right, Andrea?
Yeah. So. The slides that Andy showed previously where we were showing the work, it would literally, say, this is how it all flows. So that if that person left their job, they moved on and a new person came on board, you could literally hand them the document, well, it's an electronic form. They would look at it and say, okay, here's how the system works. And you can get your auditor to sign off on it too.
Mm-hmm. Great. What about the question about investment income that we had earlier? That was a type of income that wasn't really included when we were talking about the different kinds of income and how to automate some of the processes around that. How might that apply to investment income?
I'll take a stab, Andy, if you want me to. We didn't talk about investment income. So, it is a revenue stream for nonprofits. And I love the fact when they do have investment income coming in the door, but not every nonprofit has investment income there. But there is still the reconciliation that has to happen within your organization on a monthly basis. So if you are heavily you do have good a structure of having investments, you're still going to have to reconcile to them monthly.
Right. It looks like there was a follow-up question on the last thing, and this is from Suzanne. A follow-up on approvals. I want the person who purchased an item and manages the budget to approve invoices. And that's a practice in my organization too. So that might be 10 different people who are authorized to approve expenses. Can Bill.com handle that bill by bill, or just the signers doing approvals by batch? Do you know the answer to that? It's a pretty specific question, but there was another person who upvoted that. So I want to see if it's possible to address that.
I think you're going to pick who your approvers are going to be. And so, within the system, you're going to set up who would be. So if there's 10 different programs, you have 10 different approvers, then you're going to be setting up based on what they would be.
So you set them, you can set them all up inside Bill.com.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, one of the just to elaborate a little on this is that with these systems, you spend a little more time reviewing permissions of people and groups. So that's something I encourage you to do with a professional who's familiar with the system, someone like your accountant, your outside consultant, whoever. But you do spend more time configuring permissions and thinking about that than you did in the old days when you just handed it to, put things in a particular basket.
Yeah. There's another question about programs for government grant management that go beyond. It says QB. I assume that means QuickBooks. Any ideas on that? I'm not really familiar with that.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, grants management is a big area for us, and a big focal point for FMA and working with organizations. And so again, help where we're looking at it's really that help build the systems, either in the accounting technology that they're utilizing, or we're looking at portals that might make the process easier externally. So yeah, it's that I would say is the most challenging area for our organization is government contract grants management.
Mm-hmm. All right.
And I don't know if you've seen any portals that are out there on the government contract that you're like, oh, we really love this. Yeah.
There's a question about QuickBooks here. So we're kind of getting specific into some products like Bill.com and QuickBooks, but I know those are very widely used. So this will probably apply to a lot of people. The question is from Luce. Will QuickBooks allow for managing budgets for multiple departments within one organization? And if not, do you have a recommendation? And I think actually this may depend somewhat on which version of QuickBooks you have too. I know there's some variation.
And it's how it's set up, and I think Jean mentioned in the chat there's going to be a webinar on QuickBooks next week on budgeting, so that's fabulous. Another place that we send organizations, there's a book out there. There's a couple. It's under the same title in a way. It's called QuickBooks for Nonprofits. It's like $29.95 on Amazon or something like that. If you are going to utilize QuickBooks, you need to have it set up the right way, and that's making sure that you're utilizing the class and customers and jobs. And so because QuickBooks is, I know it says QuickBooks for nonprofits, but it really, you have to tweak it. It doesn't allow for funds. If you think about it in the nonprofit world, we need another bucket to track things. We have those funds with donor restrictions and those funds without. We can't go there. We have to start at the general ledger level and then move across, I guess, when we look at our chart of accounts, we always want to be growing horizontally, not vertically. And QuickBooks has certain limitations there. Mm-hmm. But that book does help out in terms of making sure you set that up correctly.
We do have a question from Jacqueline about less about apps and more about accounting practice. She's asking, in-kind contributions require manual journal entries, right? Mm-hmm. That's true. Okay. Glad we could quickly answer that question. There's also a question here from Tony. And Tony, I wonder if you could clarify your questions. So he wrote any recommendations for discussion forums. And I'm actually not sure, Tony, if you mean discussion forums about these tools and practices or an app for discussion forums. They're probably, the answer is probably yes, those exist for both.
So let me at least address a couple of this. So as far as discussion forums about, some vendors have some spaces you can talk to other customers. And so some vendors will provide that. Some vendors also go to the extent of, back in the old days when people could gather, of holding conventions, and where you could really meet people making the product and talk to, learn the future path and changes. So I would look for those. The second thing I would say is that as far as the sort of technology side of stuff, and I'm not familiar, and maybe Andrew, you would know on the finance side, but on the technology side, I would point people to N10. It's a large community of nonprofit technologists, and often you can connect and ask questions about specific apps in their forums and in their discussion areas. So.
Great. And I am just realizing that we are getting close to the end of our time. So let's start wrapping up here. This is lightning round, all right? I want to give each of you, including Jean, and starting with Andy, a chance to just give like 10 seconds. What do you want to leave people with from this time together?
Core, store, more.
Okay. All right. Andrea?
I think now's the time to strike in terms of having conversations around technology and going to the next level. I think what we've been going through with COVID now, and so when we talk about, well, we don't really want to do that, when we start at the governance level and say, now's the time, this is why we have to create these efficiencies for us to be able to operate in our new environment.
Yeah, and I would concur with that. I know about 20% of the people on the call today were executive directors or other senior staff, and to not come through this crisis, whatever that looks like, and to not have kind of fulfilled this mandate to create greater efficiencies and better reporting. I mean, I loved when Andy talked about visibility and where is something in the process, and engaging. And when Andrea talked about distributing information and access to information, that's the end game from my perspective. And there's just no excuse anymore, to not kind of go all the way for this automation. There's no expense excuse. There's no technology excuse. There's no, really leadership excuse for it now. So I have found this very comforting to know that so many tools exist, and it's just a question of getting the right support to implement them. Thank you.
I'll say amen to that too.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. It was great to have all of your different expertises in the space. I think it really helped a lot. And thank you all for joining us and for your excellent questions. You'll get the slides and a recording in a couple of days. There was a link to a resource in the chat, but as Andy said, all the links in the deck are live. And so there's a lot of stuff in this deck that you can go back to and revisit. And as I mentioned, we happen to be doing a budgeting in QuickBooks special seminar next week, one for cloud-based users and one for not. So go ahead and have a look at the Leading Edge membership button on the upper right-hand corner of our homepage at nonprofitquarterly.org, and you'll find that those budgeting classes, which sounds like it might be timely for some of you. And then if you don't like that, you'll know you'll need an add-on app, right? We'll show you as much as you can do in QuickBooks, and then you can make that decision. Please now complete this 2-minute evaluation. It helps us so much. Thank you to Tech Impact and to Andy and to FMA. Thank you all.